So research in Aboriginal communities, again, it's not autism specific, but I hope the messages that we share today will help in anything or any work that anybody is doing within Indigenous communities or with Indigenous children and families. So my question to us here is, are we speaking the language and culture of Aboriginal people? Or are we going in there with our academic words and our all sorts of words that they might not understand, which might turn people off before you even start? So when I talk about gathering information with our programs or within our Indigenous communities, I kind of use the analogy of storytelling because, which was mentioned before the lunch break, we've got lots of our own types of research that we've done over time or information that we've shared over time, but it was always part of oral history or sharing and ceremony and different ways of sharing information. And it wasn't collecting research and data and writing a report. It was passing on or passing down. So when we're talking about research in Aboriginal communities, asking ourselves, whose voice do we want? Whose voice are we looking for? Whose voice is important? And that's going to help you kind of engage with the people in our First Nations community. And then what are we wanting to do? Are we want to teach somebody something? Are we wanting to learn something? Are we going to share? And who are we going to share it with? All of these questions I think are important before we even go in there, so we can be ready to answer any of those questions. What are you going to do with our research? Who's it for? And talking about anonymity and confidentiality and those kinds of things. And people are going to want to feel safe if they're going to engage and be part of it. So even though we're not talking about cultural safety today, I have one little thing. So if we're going to engage with Indigenous communities or children and families, I want to know from a cultural safety perspective that they're going to feel safe and that they won't feel assaulted, they won't feel challenged, or their denial or identity is going to be criticized or minimized, and that whatever we share, it's going to be shared with respect and it's going to have meaning or purpose. And that shared knowledge, that it's going to be a shared knowledge and experience. Again, not one-sided, not to, not at, but with, and then working together and with dignity and truly listening. So that's what I hope is sort of where we come from when we're doing research projects. And I'm just going to put a little plug out there because it kind of fits. So some of you saw this brochure for the early years conference out on the table outside. You can also access it on the UBC Interprofessional Continuing Education site. But the Early Years Conference 2020 is, the subtitle is called Listen Together, Learn Together, and Act Together. I think that might be kind of a goal of research, that we're getting information, hopefully we're listening, we're learning, we're gathering, but then the final thing is acting together. So we have research projects, we complete them, we write our 20, 30, 40 page report, we share it and go, okay, we're done. We've met our contract deliverable, we did what we were supposed to do, we spent the money and we talked to people and we're done. So the piece that I think is always missing sometimes is the acting together. So whatever we do in research, what are we doing with it after and who's doing it? And this says listen together, learn together, act together. And when we were putting the title together, I said, well, why don't we just put together once, listen, learn, act together? Well, these are words directly from elders speaking to leadership in our communities. This happened to come from someone in Stolo territory. And it says, no, they're three separate things. You have to listen together, learn together, act together. So when we were putting this title together, they said, well, we should just use together once so it fits on the page better and things like that. And I said, well, that's not what we're doing. We're wanting us to do all three. So I think I just wanted to put that plug out there just to remind people that that's kind of a goal in anything that we do, and including research now. So my piece, before Shannon gets started, is just a little bit of story about research and AIDP. AIDP, you already heard me this morning say that we're going to be 28 years old in January. So we've been around for a long time. We've been around longer than the People's Family Accord, which was mentioned earlier today, longer than the First Nations Health Authority, longer than Aboriginal Head Start on reserve and off reserve. So when we first started IDP only went up to 36 months. So when AIDP established ourselves, we went, wait a minute, 36 months, that's 3 years old, and they don't go to kindergarten until 5. We don't want a gap between support. So we chose to go up to age 5 or kindergarten. So right off the bat, we were 2 years more than IDP. And I understand that they go much older than 36 months now too, but that was a time where I just said, wait a minute, we don't have anything else. We need to have support. So we went to age 5, and that's something that we learned by finding out that in our communities where we didn't have any of these other programs and services yet, we still needed to do something. So AIDP was founded on research done by our elders and leaders in the early 70s. So you might not think about elders sitting around and doing research, but they did, and it started with a conversation. What do we do? What's happening? In my community, and particularly in the early 70s, we were experiencing quite a high suicide rates between 18 and 25 years of age or so. And I said, we got to do something. What do we do? What do we do? And they were concerned. And they said, well, we have to start with the little ones. They literally said, we have to start with the little ones. What are we doing for the little ones? What are we doing for the parents? So they did their own kind of review or research and found IDP and found where it originated from, found that it was running in Canada, and basically adapted AIDP after IDP from the 70s. And so we're here, and it was out of research that we're here and wanting and having a goal of supporting our little ones. So that's how AIDP started. And actually in 2012, our nation had called a state of emergency because we were experiencing high suicide rates again in our community. So there's still so much work to be done, and it isn't just related to the early years, it's related to so many different things. So AIDP is founded on research by elders and leadership in the Coast Territory of South Vancouver Island. The next one I have that kind of in wrong order. I want to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because if you're familiar with it, there's 94 calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I carry this little book around with me everywhere I go because there's 94 calls to action, and I don't remember all of them, and especially which ones might be related to what I do or what I'm hoping to share. So I carry it around with me. There's this little book that I got actually from the First Nations Summit. They had some left over, so I got them. So if we think about research, research can be described in so many ways. And one of the things that I find interesting about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation, it was through residential school survivors who started coming forward with their stories. And then we had funds put aside. I think it was $350 million over so many years through the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. So that was to help residential school survivors on a healing journey within their communities. And I was part of the Tsakwalooten Healing Lodge program that was on Cape Mudge as a descendant of a residential school survivor. And then Cowichan Tribes also got their own program, and they hired mental health workers and counselors to support residential school survivors in our community. So that funding has come and gone, and from that, though, it opened up a lot and said, we got to do something. We can't just end. So through the government and through our own leadership, the Truth and Reconciliation was formed. So it didn't just happen, and these 94 calls to action didn't just happen without the residential school survivors, the individual nations. Murray Sinclair and his staff went all across Canada and talked to residential school survivors and gathered their stories, gathered information about the residential schools across Canada, about the priests, about the nuns, about the deaths of the children at the schools, all of that stuff. So technically that was a huge research project that the 94 calls to action came from. And there was probably many, many more, but that's what it was narrowed down to. So the TRC is a big, huge research project, but what's good about it is that it was led by Indigenous people, and through also the Indigenous leadership across Canada, and of course in partnership with the federal government. So that's a huge research project, and we don't think of it of that because that's not how we're talking about it, but we already engage in a lot of different research, and this is one of them. So yes, I carry this around everywhere. So I wanted to mention that, and then I wanted to just briefly talk about HELP, the Human Early Learning Partnership. I heard about the Human Early Learning Partnership and the EDI, or the Early Development Instrument, back in May 1998, and I can't remember the day, but it was mid-month. And I went in partnership with the Margaret Moss Health Center in the Cowichan Valley. We had our own health center on reserve where I worked through our AIDP program, and I had a really good working relationship with the one of the staff there that ran parenting programs and immunization programs and work with young parents, or any parents actually. So we partnered because we heard about this HELP and we wanted to hear more about it, so we invited HELP to come to Cowichan Valley. And so it came in May 1998, and at that time I couldn't tell you how many staff there were, but probably less than a dozen back in 1998. And Dr. Clyde Hertzman was the founder, co-founder, and the guy I used to call the big kahuna, because as it grew, there were so many people came along, all of the researchers and analysts and graphic people, and then all of the different tools that Shannon is going to talk about. So we called him and he came and met with us, and it was my responsibility to invite all of our First Nations people to the meeting. So it was open to Cowichan Valley, but then we also opened it up to Indigenous people. So people were invited from Penelakut, Halalt, Cowichan, the neighboring areas, say within an hour or so of Duncan. And so the way we do things when we invite people, we do it in person, which in this day and age probably sounds difficult to do. You'd rather email somebody or text somebody, but I made sure I went and in person visited everyone and brought them the invitation in person and said, we're coming, we'd really like you to come. So I personally invited 22 people to come to this gathering in Cowichan in May 1998. And 2 Indigenous people showed up, one from the local friendship center and then a social worker from Cowichan tribes, and then 3 counting me. So I was really disappointed, and that was sort of my first understanding about how people are feeling about research and what does it mean, and just the idea that it goes one way. So I was really, really disappointed, and I felt so bad, and I went and apologized to Clyde. I'm so sorry I invited them, and anyway. That's where we started with 2, and then that's when I started hearing about research in a not so nice way. So when we talk about research, I also think about it as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like there's good research and there's not so good research, and there's just downright ugly research when it comes to Indigenous people. So we're trying to work through that, and we're trying to change that mindset by making it safe, by making it meaningful, and by whose voice it is and what we're going to do with it. So with the Human Early Learning Partnership, it didn't end there, because like I said, that was in 1998, and it was only the EDI at the time. I had a woman who was the admin assistant in our office. Her name was Shelley Littlechild, so I always give her lots of credit, even though she moved on a long time ago. We were looking at all of this EDI stuff, and we had more questions than we had answers, and we had that experience I had in Cowichan where only 2 Indigenous people showed up. So we contacted HELP, which was Clyde and Joanne Schroeder, and said, why aren't more of our Indigenous schools participating? Like, how many of our Indigenous schools are participating? Because I'd already done some community visits where we have AIDP program, and they had a new school, and I went, oh, are you participating in HELP in the EDI? And they said no. Some of them didn't know anything about it, and some of them said no, because it's a research project. So we thought, okay, we got to go talk to Clyde. And so I got to talk to Clyde. And then when it got to a point where we needed to do more work, he passed me on to Joanne Schroeder, because Joanne was communications or something. I can't remember what her role was, but we still were involved. So now they're doing more and more presentations around the province, at UBC, down in the east side at Raycam. Yeah, he had one there. And I always remember that one, because Clyde was up there with his PowerPoint, and he was talking with his passion in his hands, and he was going, and this lady stood up and said, I don't understand a word you're saying. You're talking too much like an academic. And after he let her finish talking, he said, but I am an academic. So not only was an academic, but he was talking to Indigenous people as well, and he didn't quite know his audience. So we're kind of going, okay, you got to know your audience. You got to understand, they don't understand that. Then he did another presentation, I think it was at UBC, and there was a leader there, I think from Musqueam First Nation. And Clyde was talking about the mean this and mean that and this and that. And so that leader, he was male, stood up, he goes, I don't even know what you mean when you say mean. So another surprise, Clyde, it was like, so we talked to him, said, I'm not saying dummy down, because I'm not saying the people in the audience are dumb, but you're talking academic and they need just some layman terms. So after doing that back and forth a few times and having not really good experiences engaging with the on-reserve First Nations schools, we kind of said, you guys need help. And literally, we were saying, you guys need help. Help needs help. And so they took our words and formed the Human Early Learning Partnership Aboriginal Advisory Committee, Steering Committee. And so we have elders on that committee, we have Métis folks on that committee, we have Indigenous folks on that committee, we have early childhood development folks on the committee, education. So it's kind of a broad range. And so that's what HELP did to realize they needed help in engaging Indigenous communities. I think we've come a long way. I think there were a few years there we were spinning our wheels. And I'm not blaming HELP at all, because we keep talking about systems. Well, UBC is a huge system. And so when you're trying to make change here, it has to make it all the way up here, and that hasn't always been the easy part. So we're working with trying to change a system within a system. So I just wanted to share those as we kind of move forward now and talk a little bit about HELP and the research and engaging Indigenous communities and schools. We're still working on that. But I just had this quote that I really like from the Assembly of First Nations, which used to be called the National Indian Brotherhood back in 1972 when they wrote a policy paper. And this is why I like research. This is why I want to do research that's meaningful to us, is because we want, unless our child learns about the forces which shape him, the history of his people, their values and customs, their language, he will never really know himself or his potential as a human being. So any research that we do in the early years or for Indigenous people, that's what I hope we're doing it for, so that we're allowing our Indigenous people to revitalize their own language, their own culture, their own values, their own belief systems. And that may mean a little bit of gathering of information and research to do that, especially with the young demographic population of Indigenous people. I mean, I don't know my language. I know phrases, but I don't know my language. So what I'm hoping research will do is find the way and the space and the time for us to be able to know that every Indigenous child is going to know who he is and who his people are. And I just want to say, I mentioned something this morning and I didn't really elaborate, is that cultural appropriateness. And there is concern by Aboriginal professionals and leaders and parents that research and even assessment tools and practices used with our children are not culturally appropriate. So that's the first big, the big sort of roadblock, is that they're already looking at it and saying it doesn't fit. Working with ourselves and working with our leaders and our families and everybody we work with to try to make it more appropriate, whatever that means to individual nations. And I think for Aboriginal research, Ramona said it in her presentation about space, and I really like that idea of space, because we can't do all of this if we don't have space. If the researchers are taking up all the space, where are the Indigenous people going to be? And some of you may know Robbie Robertson. He's Indigenous and he's a musician. He has a quote, and I should have written down when he said it, but it was CBC. And somebody was talking to him about being Indigenous. And he said that we have to create space for Indigenous people to be Indigenous people, because we're missing that space. We're missing that space. And an analogy I always use is sometimes I want to quit something. Sometimes I feel like we're not making any changes. So if I leave, maybe somebody will place me and be able to create more change or better change. But then I think of my grandfather, who was a farmer, and all that beautiful broom that you see all over the place isn't native to here. It's Scottish. It's not from here. It was brought here. Now it's taking over our hillsides, our mountainsides, or wherever. And my grandpa hated broom. He just hated it because he was a farmer. So it was taking over. And so I kind of thought, well, we need people to stay where they are and keep their space, or it'll be and continue to be invaded. And I always think of my grandpa and broom when I think about that. Is that, okay, well, I'm not going to leave, I'm not going to quit because I don't want the broom to take over. And I'm not saying non-Indigenous people are broom, but I'm just saying that I think those of us who have that voice or who have that platform need to keep our space and expand it. And I think, as far as research is concerned, it has to honor and respect our ways of living, our value our culture, value our languages and our dialects, value of ancestors and elders' teachings, and value of local protocols. So those are all the basis for research. If you're going to come in and do research in Indigenous communities, you have to speak our language. Even if we speak English, you still have to speak our language, because we still have our way of knowing being. And it was said perfectly, we forget to talk about culture because we're living it. We're living our culture. So obviously it's everywhere we are. But so these are the things that I think have to lead research, is to just honor and respect our way of living, our culture, our language. And I go to my elders all the time because they have the teachings of our ancestors that aren't written down, but they're there. So we can, I think, save questions for after. That slide just didn't make it to the bottom. But I used this slide of weaving as an example of what we can all do together. We can all see ourselves as a strand of cedar, and just a strand of cedar by itself isn't very strong, but when you weave it, it becomes something that you use for picking berries, or all those baskets have kind of different duties and responsibilities. But it isn't a basket with just one strand of cedar. It's a basket, and it has strength because we're woven together. So my message would be Indigenous, non-Indigenous working together, doing research together. We have strength in weaving ourselves together instead of us and them, and I'm over here and you're over here, and I'm the academic and you're the frontline worker. Like, if we see ourselves woven together as strips of cedar, then we're going to become a really strong basket and hold our families up. So I will end there.